Shabbat Shalom. This is Shabbat Korach. Korach was the great-great-grandson of Levi, the third of Yaakov's 12 sons. And so we know that he was a cousin of Moshe and Aharon. Korach was born in Egypt, and so he experienced the miraculous journey through the Red Sea on dry land. He was present when we received the Torah at Mount Sinai. Apparently, he was a clever man, and his status as a member of the Leviim entitled him to participate in the service before God in the Mishkan. Despite this, or perhaps because of it, his standing in Israel, he believed it was his right to stand against Moshe and Aharon. His reasoning is not necessarily important, but what is very important is his heart's attitude. You see, in his heart, Korach was a rebel. He was insubordinate, unwilling to accept authority, mutinous, and very jealous. He had the same spirit as the first rebel, the first murderer on earth, Kayin. One Hasidic teacher has suggested that Korach possessed Kayin's reincarnated soul, while Moshe possessed that of Avel. Although this is biblical heresy, as no such thing as reincarnation exists, and the scriptures expressly teach against such ideas, this thought does encourage comparison. Within this context, we see that obvious comparisons can be made between Korach and Kayin and Moshe and Avel. Just as Kayin was jealous of Avel because God accepted Avel's offering and not his own, Korach was jealous of Aharon and Moshe because God had appointed them to leadership positions and not him. When God blessed Avel's offering and not that of his brother Kayin, Avel tried to comfort his brother. Likewise, Moshe attempted to calm Korach by providing reasons for him to be content with his life and circumstances and with the opportunities that he had. Both attempts failed. Kayin pursued Avel and killed him. Korach pursued his rebellious intentions against Moshe and against God to the bitter end. The principle of measure for measure plays itself out when the earth, which had opened its mouth, we're told, in Bereshit, to cover Kayin's crime, swallows Korach and all his followers. Bamidbar 16. Both Kayin and Korach spoke unrighteously, and their actions were not only against another person, they were against God himself. In recounting Kayin's murder of Avel, the Torah states, Kayin spoke with his brother Avel, and it happened when they were in the field that Kayin rose up against his brother and killed him. The text does not tell us what Kayin said, but clearly the conversation led to Avul's murder. Korach's words, Lashon Hara, took hold of the people's hearts as he cloaked his anger and his ambition in populist rhetoric aimed at enlisting their support. Korach became the organizer of a rebellion against Moshe's leadership, ultimately against the sovereignty of God over his people Israel. As we further examine the character of Korach, the rebel, we see that thoughts, speech, and actions have a manifold impact, not only on those who think, speak, and act, but also on those around them and those who follow them, and sometimes only those who view what they do like their children. And what was the character of Korach? He was a bitter, jealous, envious man who was dissatisfied with his life. He became a rabble-rouser, a troublemaker, an agitator, a firebrand. Korach used his influence and his demagogic skills to sow discontent and rebellion among the members of his young nation, a nation that was still beset by a slave mentality and idolatrous thoughts. As with all skilled troublemakers, Korach framed his accusations in such a way as to make it very difficult for Moshe to answer him, much less defend himself. He could have attacked Moshe for flaws in Moshe's character, things that seem to be most glaring. He might have said, "Why should Moshe lead us? He doesn't have the gift of glib articulation. We need someone more eloquent, someone with better communication skills to represent us to God and to represent God to us." He could have charged Moshe with disloyalty for his early life of ease in Pharaoh's household, and even for his decision to run away from the fight for his people's freedom. He might even have accused Moshe of being hot-tempered and of being a murderer if he knew that aspect of Moshe's history. But instead, he indicted Moshe for a suggested character flaw for which there could be no defense, namely, a lack of modesty. How can anyone contend with such an attack? Concerning Moshe and Aharon, Korach declared, "You take too much upon yourselves, for the whole congregation is holy, and Adonai is among them. Why then do you lift yourselves up above the assembly of Adonai?" You take too much on yourself. What answer can be given when God himself had determined their roles in leadership? The whole congregation is holy, he said. And yet we have rebellion after rebellion, which would certainly seemingly make a lie of this gem, which undoubtedly many of Israel would have nonetheless liked to believe. According to God, Moshe Rabbeinu was the most humble man on earth. Given this most unusual character trait, he was hardly likely to protest by declaring himself to be a humble man. Moshe did what he could against this rebellion. But it was only through God's intervention, and certainly not through Israel's wisdom, that we, the people of Israel, eventually affirmed Moshe as our bona fide leader. If we compare the two men, we must look at the character of Moshe Rabbeinu. We have more information about him, perhaps, than just about anybody in Scripture. Rashi points out quite correctly that we can learn a great deal about Korach's character by analyzing the accusation he makes against Moshe. Rashi writes, with great understanding of human nature, he who condemns others condemns only his own blemish. What is he saying? He's saying that a tendency to suspect and accuse others usually expresses itself in ways that reflect our own flaws. In psychology, this characteristic is known as projection, and it's all too common. In the Middle East today, we see projection in the false charges continuously leveled against Israel by her neighbors and her enemies. These enemies charge that Israel's not interested in peace, but is only concerned about subjugating and abusing so-called Palestinians. And yet, historical documents demonstrate Israel's willingness and courage to take chances by even ceding land to her enemies in order to attempt to achieve peace. When Israel ceded territory, Arafat and his company made perfunctory and public demonstrations against terror, while planning future attacks behind closed doors. And that continues under consecutive PA leaders. Their claim, as they state publicly almost every day, is truly against Israel's right to exist. And that is as it's always been. They are constantly charging Israel falsely with a ruthless massacre here, a wanton slaughter of their children there, as in Gaza. Even when the facts put such vicious lies to rest, people continue to remember the accusations rather than the explanations of falsehood. The very things of which the PA accuse Israel are reflective of their own cruelty and their own continuous acts of attrition. Israel has taken strong measures at great personal risk to its soldiers in seeking to protect human life on both sides. In contrast, the leaders of Hamas, Hezbollah, and Fatah's Al-Aqsa Brigade, all of them really, gladly sacrificed their young in the hope of emptying Israel of Jews. Since 1993, the European Commission and EU member states combined have been by far the largest contributor of aid to these people. Getting back to Korach, what was the consequence of his rebellion? The biblical narrative, which hopefully you've read this week, reveals that many died as a result of Korach's insurrection. Tragically, such rebellions against God's order take many casualties, destroying unity and hope, creating far more heat than they do light. Korach's name lives in infamy among those who have brought nothing but sorrow and suffering to our people. Our people had before them Moshe, a godly leader of good character and modest temperament, a man affirmed and chosen by God. They had seen him before the greatest throne of the age, both pleading and commanding Pharaoh to allow us to leave Egypt to worship our God. As we had seen him put his life on the line for us, not once, but many times. He was our father, our teacher, and an intermediary between Israel and God. He had served faithfully in the most difficult of roles. Was this to be his reward? Yet in the face of such libelous attack, Moshe did not retreat. He did not stand up for himself, but he also did not attack his attacker. Nor did he go off in a huff. In fact, there was no exhibition of bad temper or anger or fear or moodiness at all. In the face of what must have been one of Moshe's worst nightmares in a lifetime of bad dreams, he did very little in his own defense. His concern was for the honor of God. And Korach's religious pretensions were tested by God himself. It didn't matter that Korach might be popular with the majority of Israelites, or how many of them he'd convinced of the rightness of his cause. Evil developed to the full calls forth God's glory and judgment. The congregation of Israel was ordered to separate itself from all contact with these rebels before the earth opened up and swallowed the rebel leaders and their families who had clearly been contaminated with the same evil. Fire from God consumed the 250 who had followed Korach and offered incense unrighteously. But even in judgment, God remembered mercy, and he preserved the children of Korach, who he knew had learned an important lesson from their father's rebellion against his rightful authority, and they stood forever as an example to others. Mishlei declares, "Cast out the scorner, and contention shall go out. Strife and reproach shall cease." But Moshe and Aharon were themselves tested by this rebellion. Only mediatory mercy saved all the people from being consumed with the rebel leader Korach. The man against whom Israel had rebelled was actually their hope. Following Korach's judgment, God again declared the efficacy of his divine choices, vindicating Moshe and Aharon and the Kohanim as well. Well, the rebellion of Korach was neither the first nor the last of our rebellions. Time passed, but we failed to learn from our errors and from the chastening of God, which was repeated periodically as we chose the path of rebellion again and again. Our people sadly did not change. We called for a king so that we could be like the pagan nations around us, the Goyim. God pointed out to Shmuel, our judge, as he had to Moshe, that this was a rejection of his divine authority and kingship, although Shmuel must have felt discouraged and disheartened by his people's attitude and their choice. Israel chose as their king a man who looked the part, a good actor perhaps, but who had neither the character of a king nor the standing with God of a Shmuel. Shmuel spoke at Gilgal after Shaul's confirmation before the representative assembly convened there. He affirmed his own integrity as prophet and judge of Israel, which rested upon divine calling and years of service from his childhood. He declared to the people their ingratitude towards God and to him. He had, after all, spent his entire life serving Israel. He recounted to them something of their history, reminding them that their leaders up to this time had been selected and appointed by God, not chosen by a popularity contest. That God had used these individuals to defend and deliver them from their enemies. He appealed to them not to reject God's authority in spiritual matters, as they had done in matters of government. This is the burden of Shmuel's message to our people. God has not cast us off, although we have taken steps to cast him off. Our dependence upon and obedience to God is our only source of security and prosperity. Privileges and blessings given by God will continue only as long as we continue to worship and serve God. We would not evade God's justice by seeking to shake off his authority. As a sign to the people, Shmuel called down a terrible and awesome storm. It was the time of the wheat harvest, the end of June or early July, this time of year in fact, a time when no rain falls in the land. Usually there's no rain in Israel from Pesach to Sukkot. By extraordinary thunder and lightning, God demonstrated his displeasure, his anger even, at our choices. Israel was shown how foolish we were in our desires. Why opt for a human king to lead us when we had the power of the King of the universe working on our behalf? Could the new king command such forces as the prophet of God? Israel had chosen a carnal leader because of our own carnality, our lack of humility. God had always provided our leaders supernaturally, not those with a great appearance or personality, but individuals who were obedient and who followed and served him and who genuinely cared for us in a godly way. Shmuel confirmed to Israel God's continuing faithfulness and love. Listen to these words in Shmuel Aleph 12. Have no fear. You have indeed done all these wicked things. Do not, however, turn away from the Lord, but serve the Lord with all your heart. Do not turn away to follow worthless things, which can neither profit nor save, but are worthless. For the sake of his great name, the Lord will never abandon his people, seeing that the Lord undertook to make you his people. As for me, far be it from me to sin against the Lord and refrain from praying for you. And I will continue to instruct you in the practices of what is good and right. Above all, you must revere the Lord and serve him faithfully with your heart, and consider how grandly he has dealt with you. Despite everything we had done, Shmuel encouraged us to follow God and to serve him with our whole hearts. He said that God would not forsake us for the sake of his holy and glorious name. It has been God's pleasure that we have been made his people, and his choices are irrevocable, unchanging. Shmuel comforted the people, promising not only to intercede for them before God as they had requested, but to continue to guide and teach them also. He was a faithful watchman, as was Moshe before him. Only fear the Lord and serve him in truth with all your heart, for consider how great things he has done for you. So the question to us is, do we walk in the footsteps of Kayin and Korach? If you set yourself in the place of authority and control in your life, you are walking in the footsteps of Kayin and Korach. You are in rebellion against God. You are in rebellion against God if you attempt to sidestep his authority by suggesting that the spiritual leaders he has placed over you don't know as much as you do, aren't as much in tune with God as you are, have no right to tell you what to do. That is, exhort or challenge your lifestyle. Or if you place anyone or anything ahead of God and his commandments, you are in rebellion against God. If you consider other interests and concerns more important than God's calling on your life and your active worship of and service for him, you are in rebellion against God. Consider the cost of rebellion in the history of our people. Do you think God's attitude about rebellion has changed? Think about God's involvement in your life. Mashiach Yeshua died in atonement for your sin so that you could be reconciled to God. Through him you may enter into the family of God, into God's promises and provisions, into the people of God as sons and daughters of Israel. How could Israel rebel against God after all God had done for us? But what about you and me? Hasn't God done as much for us personally as he did for our people? If you are in rebellion, what is your excuse? We are warned in the scriptures to exercise care if we think we stand, lest we should fall. Perhaps your rebellion isn't as open or as obvious as that of Israel under Moshe or Shmuel. But if you reject God's authority in any area of your life, you are walking in the footsteps of Kayin and Korach. Consider the judgment you bring upon yourself, the cost of rebellion. The opposite of rebellion is obedience. Obedience is faith in action. Faith is having the confidence that God loves you and wants the very best for your life. Faith is knowing that God is in charge and is doing or allowing that which will cause you to grow spiritually and to become the person He has created you to be. Even His chastening is for the purpose of bringing you into proper relationship with Him so that you can grow and develop to your full spiritual potential. If you genuinely believe, then act in obedience, and He will do the rest. True emunah, true faith, implies absolute bitachon, trust, confidence, and a willingness to receive what God offers, even if it's not what you're expecting. God's abundance will flow into your life when you reject all rebellious attitudes. Follow Shmuel Hanavi's advice. Fear Adonai and serve Him in truth with all your heart. Consider the great things He has done for you. Reject rebellion of any kind and pursue, literally chase after, righteousness. When you do this, God will bless your life abundantly, and you will be an example, an encouragement, and a blessing to others. Have a wonderful Shabbat, and may you have a blessed week.